All right, hello, and welcome to the real first episode of Real Seekers Beyond. This is going to be basically, I, as an academic philosopher, have taken both taught and taken as a student several secular philosophy courses at university, at Ryerson University, and other universities, and I want to share that knowledge with you guys and about some of those courses and help you guys to understand the secular world of philosophy outside of the context of Christian apologetics. Although I may incorporate some Christianity related stuff from time to time as examples. But the first course here is going to be one of the courses I taught called SSH 105, or Critical Thinking. It is a secular philosophy course looking at critical thinking and the use of logic. So let's get into the first lesson here. And here's a quick course overview. So this course is going to be adapted from my teaching SSH 105 at Ryerson University. Obviously, SSH 105 is a required course for a lot of students in the Faculty of Arts programs. It's a required first-year undergraduate university course. And the calendar describes this course as follows. Rational discourse has long been viewed as a principal force for social change. In this course, we will examine the structures and principles that undergird all forms of rational discourse, and we will learn how to assess the logical strength and persuasiveness of particular discourses. These skills will be applied to arguments found in everyday life and to the formulation of one's own positions. So that's kind of the broad overview from the university itself. Obviously, I'm going to be adapting my course based on that material and giving you kind of, for a fraction of the cost, a non-accredited, unofficial version, but you'll still get the same educational content as though you were taking the course. So that's great. So continuing on with the course overview, the course will be made up of 4 main units. And obviously, there will be multiple class lessons within each unit, maybe about 3 to 4 or so, or 5 at the most, within each of the 4 main units. So Unit 1 will be an introduction to critical thinking, primarily definitional. Unit 2 will cover the characteristics and classification of arguments. And then Unit 3 will cover argument reconstruction. So how we reconstruct arguments. Obviously, people don't always give us arguments in standard form with premise. When you're having a fight with your wife or your brother or something like that, they don't really come to you and say, premise 1, you hurt me. Premise 2, you're stupid. Conclusion, therefore, I'm right, you're wrong. Like, that just doesn't happen in real life. Oftentimes, you have to reconstruct, discern, and then reconstruct what the argument is. So I'm going to give you a systematic approach to reconstructing arguments that you encounter in real life. And a part of that will also include argument diagramming, which I think is very helpful for people who are visual learners and that sort of thing. So it'll give you a bunch of techniques there. Finally, we'll finish off with Unit 4, which is probably the best one, the most fun, evaluating arguments. So that'll deal with how we evaluate the various arguments, and that will include things like logical fallacies, which a lot of people like. So look out for that. Now, in terms of the 2 main texts that I'm using when I taught this course, this is where the majority of the material came from. So one, Richard Feldman's Reason and Argument book, which is the 2nd edition. I believe that's from Oxford University Press as well. And then we have Chris MacDonald and Lewis Vaughan's The Power of Critical Thinking, the 5th Canadian edition, again, published in 2019 by the Oxford University Press. So if you have extra money and you want to buy those texts to get ahead or do extra study, that's great. Otherwise, don't worry, I'll do the hard work for you, the paying Patreon here. So I'm going to summarize, I'm going to read the text and give you what you need to know from them. Okay, so let's move on. So the first thing is that we have to know is, well, look, this whole course is in critical thinking. What the heck is critical thinking? Well, the technical definition is that we use in the course is, quote unquote, critical thinking is the systematic evaluation and or formulation of beliefs or statements by or in accordance with rational standards. And the important key thing to realize here is this word here, it's systematic. And what we mean by that is it's systematic because it involves distinct procedures and methods. So not just gut feelings or emotions or stuff like this. Get out of here. No, we are using distinct procedures and methods used in accordance with the rules of logic. That's what systematic means. And that's what separates critical thinking from just biased thinking or emotional thinking or any other kind of just reactionary type thing. This is where it's at in terms of critical thinking. And it's important to note that critical thinking is used both to evaluate our existing beliefs and arguments, as well as to help us to formulate new beliefs and new arguments in order to come to new knowledge. It evaluates our beliefs in terms of how well are our beliefs supported by the reasons or the evidence that we present. So that's what critical thinking is in a nutshell. Now, there has to be some key definitions here. So on the question of what critical thinking is, it's important to understand what are some of the elements. You talk about a systematic method with distinct procedures and methods used in accordance with the rules of logic. What is that all about? Well, in order to understand what that is, we have to understand what certain terms are in philosophy in a technical sense here. So the first thing is, what is a statement or an assertion or claim? Now, a statement is an expression by a declarative sentence that is intended to make a claim of some sort. In other words, it's stating that something is true or not. It's a claim that, for example, it is true that today is Friday. I am shorter than you. It is snowing in Toronto right now. You are asserting that something is, in fact, the case. And obviously, as we'll find out, statements can be either true or false, right? It could be false that it is, in fact, snowing in Toronto right now. But that's the main point about what a statement is. It's a declarative sentence. You're declaring through a sentence, spoken or written, that something is true or something is the case. And that declarative sentence could be either true or false. And this contrasts with what philosophers call a proposition. So sometimes you'll hear in common sense, they'll equate, well, a statement and a sentence and propositions, they're all really just the same thing. No, we have to distinguish what these two things are as proper philosophers and logicians here. Statements and propositions are different, right? So statements are declarative sentences. I am shorter than you. It is snowing in Toronto right now. Propositions, on the other hand, refers to the specific thought or concept or idea which the statement is meant to express or represent or convey, right? So think of the statements as though it's the words, it's the sentences you're using, right? I am shorter than you. That's the statement. The proposition is the idea or concept behind that statement, right? That the notion, the idea of you being shorter than somebody else or something like that, or the concept, the idea that it is snowing in Toronto right now. And just to help kind of illustrate the difference here, it's important to note that it is possible for two different statements or declarative sentences to represent the exact same idea or proposition. So, for example, my name is Dale, right? And then here's another statement, je m'appelle Dale. Well, both of these are different statements. There's different words used. Je m'appelle is different from my name is, right? But they both represent the exact same idea, the same thought, the same proposition, namely about, the concept of what my name is. But they just use the different words because they're in different languages. One is in English, the other's in French. So they have different words, different sentences, but the same proposition. Likewise, the reverse is also true. It's possible for the same statement, the same sets of words and sentences to express totally different propositions, depending on what the context is, who's saying it, when it's said, where it's said. So think of, for example, I am hungry. When I say I am hungry, you could use the exact same words and you say I am hungry. So the statements are exactly the same, but they express different propositions depending on who is making that statement. When I say I am hungry, that means Dale is hungry. But when you say I am hungry, that means David Russell, Tyler Fowler, whoever is saying that statement, they are hungry. So it's a totally different thought, a totally different idea. They're saying they are hungry. That's what the proposition is in that case. Or it will snow tomorrow. Okay, great. It will snow tomorrow. Well, depending on what day it is, what is represented by tomorrow. For me, I'm recording this on a Monday, so tomorrow would be a Tuesday, May 14th. So it will snow tomorrow, meaning referring to May 14th. But someone can use those precise words on Friday. It will snow tomorrow. And in that case, the proposition or thought or idea behind that statement is that it will snow on Saturday, May 18th, or whatever it is, right? So you get the context, right? The same statement can express different ideas or propositions depending on the context. Now, the thing here that unites them, both statements and propositions are necessarily factual in nature. So again, that just means propositions and statements both try to express that something is factual, whatever it's stating. It's a fact. It will snow tomorrow. It's a fact. My name is Dale. And both statements and propositions can either be true or false. It's either true or it's false that my name is Dale. It's either true or it's false that it will snow tomorrow, so on and so forth. So I think that helps in terms of statements versus propositions and understanding the difference there. Now, it's also important to note that not all sentences are statements, right? Not all sentences necessarily represent something that is either true or false. They're not necessarily asserting something in all cases. Statements always assert something to be true, but not all sentences do that. Not all words being put together. So, for example, sometimes we have things that represent a sentence that represents a question. Well, a question is not a statement. Should I go to class today? You're not that. It doesn't make sense to say, well, is that question true or false? Is it true or false? Should I go to class today? It's a question. There is no truth value to that, right? Now, there may be a truth. The answer to that question, that may be a statement like, yes, you should go to class today or else you will fail the course. Great. That answer to that question, that's a statement. But the question itself is not a statement. The question itself can't be true or false. Same with exclamations, things like nachos or something like that, like, wow, nachos or something like that. Exclamations are not in themselves statements. That screaming out nachos is neither true nor false. And there's also commands, right? Giving someone a commandment, shut up and go take a nap right now. Again, that command can't be true or false in itself. It's just a command. It's not asserting that something is true or false or anything. But by contrast, C, eating at the new breakfast place was a terrible mistake. That's a statement. That's a claim. It could either be true or it's false. But this guy is stating he wants us to believe that it's true that eating at the new breakfast place was a terrible mistake. So he's making a statement in C, whereas the others are not statements. They're sentences, but they're not statements. They're not assertions of fact. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, some more key definitions. So there's a lot of definitions, especially in lecture 1, but it's important to understand the course. So remember that definition of critical thinking. Remember, it's systematic. Why? Because it involves distinct procedures and methods used in accordance with the rules of logic. Well, let's find out a little bit more about those rules of logic. Well, in order to be consistent with logic, this usually entails that someone has to make statements that present art in a way that they present arguments to believe that their statements are true. And so, in the first place, what is an argument proper? Well, an argument is a set of statements. So it's a bunch, multiple statements, more than one, in which one or more statements, the premises, are intended to support another statement, namely the conclusion, right? So arguments are so what are premises? Premises are the statements, one or more statements that are offered as reasons or evidence to support the accepting or believing of the conclusion statement. And the conclusion is the statement that or statements, plural, if there's multiple conclusions, that the speaker or writer wants you to accept or believe as being true. And because it's being supported on the basis of the premises or the reasons for thinking that the conclusion is true. So basically, our arguments are just a set of statements, right? It's got premises as it's got a conclusion, what somebody wants you to believe, and then it has premises, the reasons for thinking that that conclusion is in fact true. So there's at least two or more statements involved there. And here's a basic example, right? So you have one statement, premise one, all whales are mammals. Premise two, Moby Dick is a whale. So that's statement number two. Then we have statement number three, which is the conclusion. Well, Moby Dick is a mammal. In this case, the statement that the person who made this argument wants you to believe is that Moby Dick is a mammal. That's what they want you to accept. And they present two reasons for this that together warrant it, right? So all whales are mammals and Moby Dick is a whale. Now, the last bit of technical terminology we need to know is what is an inference? And it's the inference that allows us to go from the premises, these two statements here, and then make our conclusion that, in fact, Moby Dick is a mammal. So an inference just refers to the logical moving from a premise or premises. In this case, we have two premises in this example, to the conclusion, to infer the truth of the conclusion. And critical thinking is all about logical inferences. And as we're going to find out later on in this course, there are many different kinds of logical inferences in accordance with the rules of logic. So we're going to be learning later on in this course about some of the common patterns of reasoning, which we know as the various deductive argument patterns. And there are a whole host of them that we're going to be learning about in a later lesson plan. And believe it or not, some logical inferences are good, right? So this would be an example of a logical inference that's good. The conclusion does seem to be a logical move from the premises there. The premises do provide good reasons to infer that the conclusion is true here. So we can move from the premises to believing the conclusion. But there are also logical inferences that are proven to be bad logical inferences. They don't follow the rules of logic. And again, we're going to be looking at some of those good and bad argument patterns later on in this course. But for right now, just understand that, look, there are good logical inferences, and there are bad logical inferences. So yeah, I hope that's pretty clear. Now, there are 3 steps, as we'll learn, in terms of the systematic study of arguments in accordance with the rules of logic. This relates to the first one, right? We have to determine or discern, is somebody making an argument or not? Because not all sets of statements actually represent proper arguments. So here's just some examples of sets of statements that don't constitute an argument, right? So in the first place, you may have just descriptions, right? Don't get confused here. A lot of texts just describe, maybe like a historical text is just describing what happened. They're not making arguments. They're not trying to get you to believe some kind of conclusion necessarily. They're just merely descriptive and saying, hey, this is what happened. I'm giving you a narrative description of some event or something that exists. and just describing that event or thing. They're not making an argument, they're just giving a description. There are also opinions, and obviously with the first year university students, we have to clarify this because a lot of times students, when they're 18 years old and even later on in life, they conflate opinions with conclusions of an argument, and they're not the same thing, right? Because if you're making an argument, there has to be conclusions, but there have to be those premises. There has to be the reasons for thinking the conclusion is true. Simply asserting your opinion is not an argument unless it has both those elements, right? If you're just asserting your opinion, there's no inference going on. You don't have reasons from which you infer the truth of the conclusion. Opinions are just saying blah blah blah. David Russell's a heretic. You know, Real Seekers is the best podcast in the world. I'm just giving opinions. I'm just asserting things. So I am making a statement in this case, but I'm not making an argument. I'm not giving a set of statements that are following the rules of logical inference, whereby I have a conclusion supported by one or more premises from which I can infer the truth of the conclusion. No, I'm just asserting my opinion, and that opinion can either be true or false as a statement. Conditionals, right? The traditional if-then statements. If it is raining today, then I'm not going to go swimming. Well, that's a statement. It's either true or false, but it's not an argument. If-then statements, or conditionals, as we call them, are not arguments in themselves. And then finally, we have explanations. And this I find atheists and skeptics online. Okay, so this isn't Christian apologetics. So I find that a lot of people online confuse and conflate arguments with explanations. And, they ask you, well, why do you believe something and stuff like that, right? And then you will go to answer, and then, oh, that's illogical, that's irrational, or they'll say that's not a good argument, or you're committing this logical fallacy, and haha, we got you. But actually, the joke's on them. They're really being quite stupid and foolish because, look, they asked you a why question, and you're giving them the proper response, an explanation. There is no burden of proof with an explanation. It's not an argument. Right? You're just explaining to them. You ask me, why do I believe something? Well, here's why, right? I believe it because, I believe in Santa Claus because I heard one Christmas Eve, I stayed up as a little kid and I heard some bells jingling on the tree at midnight. That's not an argument. It's just explaining, well, why do I believe in Santa Claus? I heard a bell one day. Or why do you not believe in Santa Claus? Oh, well, I woke up one day and there was my dad up there instead of Santa Claus at midnight. So I knew it was a farce at that point. That's not that's an explanation. You're explaining why something happened or why you believe something, but you're not necessarily giving an argument. Arguments are what tell you why you should believe something from a rational or logical perspective. That's the difference, right? If you're presenting reasons for why someone ought to believe your conclusion as a rational agent, that's what the argument is all about. But just answering the simple question of why, you can give, well, here's my reason as to why, but I'm not presenting this as a reason that the rational agent like you ought to believe there is or isn't a Santa Claus. I'm just giving you kind of a descriptive explanation as to why I currently believe this or don't believe this. So that's a key thing, and a lot of people get confused by that. Don't conflate explanations with arguments proper. Now, as I said, there are 3 systematic steps regarding arguments. So the first one is what we've just kind of been looking at, right? So the first thing is you have to determine, are there a set of statements here or not? Secondly, that's the second aspect of step 1. Are those sets of statements serving as an argument? Is there a conclusion that someone wants me as a rational agent to accept? And are they presenting reasons or premises to think that that conclusion is true and that I ought to believe it as a rational agent? Is there an argument here or not? That's step one. Step two is, okay, if there is an argument, and assuming it's jumbled up, reconstruct that argument. And again, we're going to be finding out there are a whole host of rules that one has to employ when they're reconstructing arguments. And then finally, three, how do we evaluate that argument? Is it a good argument or a bad argument? Essentially, with this simple three-step process, even though it sounds simple, trust me, there's a lot of work to do within each of these steps. But as we go through this course, we're primarily going to be moving on and looking at steps 2 and 3. I think we've kind of went over step 1 in this episode. And we're going to be looking at that and what's entailed by all of that. Okay, so the next question is, after finding out what critical thinking is, what it entails, and what it involves in terms of arguments, we have this other question, right? Why should we think critically? Why should I engage in critical thinking? Who cares about this stuff? Well, there are at least 5 reasons why. Number 1, because there is a strong correlation between belief and truth. You know, we seem to want to believe things that are true rather than false. We have this need as human beings and this pleasure in deriving true beliefs as opposed to having false beliefs. And we just tend to, when we discover something is, that we believe is false, we usually discard that, like belief in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. And we usually, oh my goodness, I wish I never believed, I wish, I should never have believed that. I want to believe only true things. And you'll hear people like Matt Dillahunty, who's an atheist apologist. Sorry, I guess religion's coming into it a little bit, but just as an example. And he's right. He says, look, I want to believe as many true things as possible and disbelieve as many false things as possible. And that does seem to be the goal as human beings. Most people have this tendency to want to believe true things. Well, using critical thinking is how we ensure that our beliefs are in fact true. And it shows us that there can be a strong correlation between using critical thinking and arriving at true beliefs. Secondly, the other thing is, well, because we in large part are determined by our actions and our choices. And I don't mean fully causally determined there. That's a debate in free will. But look, it plays the influence, it is an influential role. Our actions and choices are influenced, at the very least, if not determined, by our thoughts and our beliefs. What we believe, our worldview, radically affects the choices and the actions that we do. And if we don't choose our beliefs carefully, that's essentially us giving up our autonomy. We're giving up control. We're so stupid because we haven't critically thought about our beliefs that we're just kind of reeds in the wind. We're blowing in the wind and following. Oh, I believe this. Okay, cool. Whatever you say, man. Yeah. Oh, believe the opposite. Okay. And we see that with, so many kids today and stuff like that. Like, the BLM movement, they had no goal or rationality. So yeah, critical thinking, engaging in critical thinking, it empowers us. That's the point. It empowers us to have more personal freedom in the beliefs and worldviews that we have and hold to be true. We're not just passively accepting whatever our parents or teachers or culture tells us to believe. We're not mindless. We're mindful. And that's a good thing. Critical thinking, thirdly, provides us with the means to fulfill and attain our passions and desires, and especially our ultimate ones, right? Through better knowledge and understanding, it allows us to engage in better means to ends reasoning. For example, hey, if I want to buy this swimming pool, I better save up $50,000. That means I need to get a job. So I'm going to work and start saving my money towards that $50,000 goal. And that's going to buy me that pool. Oh boy. Right. So that's another reason to engage in critical thinking. Fourthly, critical thinking provides us the means to think outside the box. it cultivates human creativity and innovation. We progress, we better ourselves. Just think of modern science and how people 100 years ago were basically they lived in a world that was far more similar to people from thousands of years ago than to us today, who are just a century or less away from them, right? People living in the early 1900s were radically different. And that's as a result of the cumulative knowledge and innovation that critical thinking has allowed us to put two and two together and come up with amazing things. We're flying in the air with airplanes. We have cell phones. We can talk across oceans. To quote The Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which was a pretty good movie I saw this weekend, humans, we could fly like eagles fly. We could talk across whole oceans. We're just amazing. It's just incredible what human beings are capable of in the 21st century. And that is because of critical thinking. Without that, we'd still be living in the Stone Age with, in mud huts or something like that, probably. And finally, and fifthly, and this will bring us to our last point for this episode, it gives us the means to attain knowledge. And obtaining knowledge is a good in and of itself. It's intrinsically valuable and good, and human beings get pleasure out of attaining knowledge. And the true beliefs that are entailed through that knowledge. And it's that key word, knowledge. That's what I want to focus on in part 2 of our introductory lesson. But for here, right now, I'm just going to, okay, so I'm not done actually. So sorry, that's what we're going to focus on, the knowledge part, starting up in our next part 2. But before we get to that, just to finish off part 1, look, I've given you 5 reasons why we should think critically. But there are, of course, skeptics and objectors, people who say we shouldn't think critically. It's bad to be a critical thinker. And they claim that we should avoid thinking critically because it leads to so many people becoming pompous jackrabbits, right? Pompous, arrogant, and stuff. They're excessively critical. They're cynical. They're emotionally cold. And they're creatively constrained. These are some of the criticisms people have. Number 1, with the first 3, it is true that, unfortunately, for a lot of people today who engage in critical thinking, or at least try to, it's almost like especially with the internet, they've been dehumanized. They've been turned into these bots. And I noticed this in my apologetics ministry with a lot of online atheists and skeptics who just mindlessly appeal to logical fallacies without even understanding what the fallacy is, how it works, and all this stuff. So in a way, critical thinking has led to some of these downfalls. But the problem here is that it's not critical thinking in itself that has led to this. There are a lot of critical thinkers who are not excessively critical, who aren't cynical, they aren't emotionally cold. So critical thinking in itself is really just a set of skills that need not be used in these various bad ways. They can and have been used in good ways, in the opposite ways. It's on the person, the critical thinker themselves, to ensure that they're using this set of skills, critical thinking skills, in a responsible manner and in a manner that's ethical, right? So that they don't take on these negative character traits. It's not the fault of the critical thinking. It's not the system. It's the people. And I would argue as a Christian, we're all fallen. We're all sinners. And this is why, critical thinking is corrupted into people that twist it and take on unwanted or sinful character traits and that sort of thing. So don't blame the system. Critical thinking is good. The people who abuse critical thinking in these ways, they are bad. They are doing a bad thing. It's not the fault of the skills, the critical thinking themselves. And as to the creative constraint, well, as I said above, that's just total nonsense. It's the exact opposite. It leads to unbounded creativity. We keep building upon our knowledge. So critical thinking is all about thinking outside of the box. It frees our minds from the shackles of our own limitations, and it forces us in accordance with the rules of logic to challenge our fundamental assumptions, our biases, to overcome them. It forces us to ask hard questions about our own beliefs and to reject our biases, stereotypes, and other unreasonable assumptions. My gosh, how could you say this is not the greatest thing that ever existed? This is amazing that God has given us, God given every human being to greater or lesser degrees due to the fall. We have critical thinking and critical reasoning skills. Wonderful. I mean, I couldn't think of a better gift to have been given from our Lord and Creator. So yeah, that's it for my first lecture on this. Obviously, yep. So that's it for part one. Next time in part two, we're going to pick up with looking at that main reason about knowledge. What does knowledge entail? And on that front, what are some of the impediments that hinder critical thinking and the obtaining of knowledge through the use of critical thinking? So that's what and there'll be some other stuff. So that's what we're going to start by looking at in the next lecture for part two. Other than that, I hope you guys learned a lot from part one. I know it was very definition or terminological or term heavy, I guess, definition heavy. But it is crucial and critical in this course that you understand the differences between these definitions, and it will really help you in understanding what's coming next in the course. So that said, thank you very much and have a great day. See you next time.